Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. We're recording this episode on the evening of August 23rd, an eventful day with news coming out this afternoon from Russia that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of Wagner, and 6 others, along with crew, may have died in an Embraer business jet that nosedived in Tver Oblast in Russia, having left Moscow and flying in the direction of St. Petersburg, or perhaps, as some have suggested, Putin's residence at Valdai, which is on the way to St. Petersburg. My 2 guests tonight to discuss the implications of this are Rob Lee, a Russian military analyst at Foreign Policy Research Institute, and Jack Margolin, author of an upcoming book on Wagner Group and a terrific expert on the topic. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Dmitri.
So, Jack, maybe we start with you. We don't know a lot right now. We don't have confirmation that these people have even died. But if we just assume that the flight manifest is a reflection of who was actually on the plane, and if you can believe the news coming out of Russia, it looks like Prigozhin, it looks like Dmitri Utkin, who really founded Wagner, are among the dead, along with a few other Wagner folks. But a lot of the commanders that have been responsible for much of the success of Wagner, the field commanders, are still alive and kicking, and presumably are in various places across Africa, maybe Belarus, maybe recuperating in parts of Russia. But what is your best take right now on what is going to happen to Wagner if we just assume that Prigozhin and Utkin are indeed dead? Can it continue without them? Can field commanders pull it together? What is your best sense of where things are moving toward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And ruling out the possibility of body doubles, et cetera, any more twists in this plot. I think that whatever form Wagner would survive in after this would be drastically different from what we've seen so far. The incentives of the group, things like the discipline, the command structure, a lot of that has been, I think, unique to this iteration of Wagner, and you're going to lose that without Prigozhin or Utkin. Even if the field commanders that have combat experience and that really form the backbone of the organization are retained, even if the Russian military attempts to bring this under the MOD or graft it onto another structure, I don't think it's going to be able to have the same level of trust that Wagner previously enjoyed. That means not having the same access to recruitment, equipment. They're simply not going to have the same scale, and I think that would really impact their operations throughout places like Africa and lately Belarus. So the picture of what I see possibly happening here, a diminishment of Wagner to appear more like some of the other PMCs that we see out of Russia, using PMCs here in scare quotes. Obviously, those are under pretty direct authority of security services in Russia.
But let me challenge you on that, Jack, because these other PMCs that have been started by Gazprom, Fakel, and all these, even Orthodox Church has started one. I mean, most of them don't really have combat experience, right? A lot of these people are sort of glorified security guards that have been recruited and pressed into these services. Wagner is unique, right? Because these guys actually have a lot of combat experience, both before joining Wagner in the military and since then. And that's what makes it such a fairly effective force, is it not?
It is. I think that's a key part of it, right? Like, these guys have seen action in a variety of theaters that's pretty hard to find a parallel for amongst even the Russian armed forces in recent memory. However, I think that their ability to be effective is largely informed by things like the command structure that they have, which we can gather from both the statements of fighters and from leaked documentation, and particularly the independence that field commanders and lower echelons of command are given in the field in order to be reactive or be adventurous in terms of the tactics that they employ. If we compare them to something like Redoute, another PMC that employs a lot of experienced fighters, including people they pulled over from Wagner, we can see that their performance in the field, at least what we've seen of it, is very different. And the other aspect that's different is the fact that Redoute has historically fulfilled roles that are very unlike those of Wagner. Prior to the war in Ukraine, they were really doing site security, fulfilling essentially lower risk roles, which is an area that many of these PMCs seem to gravitate towards. In Ukraine, they tend to have gravitated towards deploying men to the front and really focusing on how many bodies they can field, as opposed to effectiveness on the field, looking for symbolic victories like Wagner and Bakhmut.
Rob, let me go to you. We were talking before we started recording, you and I, about some of your predictions, the predictions of our friend Mike Kaufman post-mutiny in June, and you guys got it pretty right on what was going to happen to Wagner and Prigozhin. What are your reflections on the day and what Jack has said about the future of Wagner? Do you agree that Wagner, the old Wagner, is basically dead, and whatever happens to it going forward will be very, very different from before?
Sure. So, back when the mutiny happened, my initial thought was that, we heard these kind of terms from Dmitry Peskov about this agreement that Wagner would go to Belarus and, potentially that they have, they came to some kind of agreement. And it was pretty clear at the time that that was not likely to be a long-term solution. And it was pretty clear that they kind of reached a short-term compromise that could have people save face, but long-term, this is not workable. And, my view, it was basically that, once Prigozhin had shown himself to be a threat to Putin, that, it would take time. But at some point, when the Russian security services were back in a better position to force the issue, they would try to either force him out of Wagner, or they would try to replace Wagner in its role overseas in Africa and other countries, because really Wagner plays a really important role in, in supporting Russian foreign policy, and as, basically as an arm of the Russian government, even though it has, a degree of autonomy. So it's not surprising that, they took some kind of action. As you said before, let's qualify all this by saying, we don't know the full details yet. So, we're talking about this. But, my view, we're looking at today, that there's often, when people die in Russia, a lot of people always often say, this is, suspicious. This is, they kind of assume it's assassination. A lot of times that's not true. In this case, I think this looks like it was a deliberate attempt to kill him. And I think, the footage we've seen so far of the plane, it looked as though maybe one of its wings was clipped off. There are sounds apparently of explosions in the air, but from eyewitnesses, kind of consistent with, use of air defense. And, the fact that this was Yevgeny Prigozhin, Dmitri Alperovitch, these really key leadership of Wagner, that'd be a pretty massive coincidence to say this occurred and that it was an accident. So I do think it is probably deliberate. But
it doesn't mean, even if it's deliberate, Rob, it doesn't necessarily mean it's Putin, right? This could have been Shoigu settling scores, right? This did not have to necessarily be an order directly from Putin.
So, I think after the mutiny, and even before, right? I mean, I think that was astounding about the mutiny itself is that, Putin likes to play different factions in both the Russian government and in kind of in private enterprise against each other to kind of, maintain power. And what was shocking about this development is that before this, it was clear that he was playing Wagner off the MOD. And I think during the Battle of Bakhmut, he increasingly was getting frustrated with what Prigozhin was doing. And at the end of that battle, when the MOD was trying to force all private, military companies or these kind of volunteer groups, these always pseudo groups, to sign contracts with the MOD, Putin came out and said, "I support this." Right, and that was the clear moment was Putin took a side, and he was very clearly saying, "I'm supporting the MOD on this issue," and Prigozhin did not listen to that, and that's why when he did the mutiny, it was an act of defiance, not just against the MOD, but against above that. And so I think once that occurred, once there was this threat to Putin, and I don't think Prigozhin was trying to replace Putin or anything along those lines, but what he did was a public threat to Putin nonetheless. And I think after that, Putin kind of came to the view that this is not someone I'm allowed to maintain a power position anymore, and that once we we're in a position to do so, I'm going to allow the security services to push him out. And I think there's always been frustration from some Russian security services about Wagner's role. Clearly, the MOD has had issues with Wagner during this war, and I think at this point, basically after the mutiny, Putin was going to side with them completely because they were more loyal. Whereas Prigozhin was not loyal, and that was a enduring kind of risk to him long term. And again, I think when the mutiny happens, even though clearly Russian intelligence services had some idea this was going to happen, I think Putin was kind of procrastinating. I don't think he took the kind of strong decision to stop it. But once it happens, then I think he was fully on board with supporting all these different other factions against Prigozhin. And that once they're in a strong position to force the issue, I think he was going to support that. It wasn't clear at the time this would necessarily be an assassination, but I think it's whether in some way or another Prigozhin was going to be pushed out, and it was a question of how they would do this. And I think the timing relates to basically FSB, GRU, different Russian government organizations. They had to figure out how to basically put plans in place to replace Wagner, to replace its role overseas, and to make sure they could do this where it would kind of have, minimal disruption to those other kind of overseas activities.
But don't you think, and I don't want to get too far into speculation because there's still so much we don't know, but like killing someone with a SAM missile seems like the least efficient way to kill someone, to assassinate someone, and also the riskiest because A, there's no question about attribution. You can't claim this was, mafia razborki, gangland warfare, and some, gangster that had a problem with Prigozhin tried to assassinate him. And two, like there's just a lot of factors that are problematic in terms of the plane can take off late, it can take a different path, right? So if you're trying to do an assassination, it seems like there's much easier ways to do that than using a SAM battery.
So, there's a question in this case because obviously the Russian security services have assassinated people overseas before, defectors and other people, and we know that poisoning has been one of the means of choice here. In this case, Russia may have been happy to make this a kind of overt step, and I think the other factor here too is that it wasn't just Prigozhin, it was Utkin, it was all these other kind of important figures on that plane, and it was an opportunity to get rid of all of them at once. And maybe there are other opportunities to just kill Prigozhin, but maybe other ones wouldn't have been there. And at this point, it was an ability to kind of go after all these people at once. Again, assuming that this was a deliberate act, we don't know that for certain. But if this is what it appears to be, that might be one of the reasons. And again, also, look, the mutiny was an extraordinary event, right? And one of the big takeaways many people had was that because Prigozhin didn't crush it, and that he came to some agreement that he looked weak. Well, ultimately, if the people who kind of perpetrated this, were all killed in a pretty public way, it's maybe in a way of Putin pushing back and trying to reassert control. And, look, there isn't an obvious competitor to him. There's always a question after this event that, it didn't seem as though Prigozhin had really won long term. And, at the end of the day, Putin may have reasserted his position in a pretty strong way. And, again, over this war, we've seen many extraordinary things happen, and it's not that shocking that Putin would be willing to do something kind of in an overt way to send a signal to other people.
So, Jack, there were other people on that plane, in addition to Prigozhin and Utkin. The ones that caught my eye were Prapustin, Makaryan, and Tatman. And what do you know about those people? And maybe talk as well a little bit about Utkin for people that may not be as familiar with Wagner as you are. Talk about his role both in starting the organization, but also in ongoing running of it.
Yeah, definitely. So the three folks that you named there are the three sort of easiest to identify as Wagner fighters. Propustin, Wagner fighter, had a personnel number, documented everything with his call sign, etc. Same goes for Makaryan. We know that he, for example, was in Kar. He got injured in Libya. He's listed amongst their list of 300s or folks that were injured in action. Totmin, also another Wagner fighter, not a whole lot known about him. And Matusyev is the one person in which there's really very little information. Utkin is certainly, I think, the highest profile person on that aircraft other than Prigozhin himself. He is the person that is the alleged namesake of Wagner, given that he has this, as often referred to sort of diplomatically, fascination with the imagery of the Third Reich. Really likes the composer, Richard Wagner. Reportedly used to go into combat wearing a German helmet from World War II. Utkin had previously served with the Slavonic Corps, which is sort of the predecessor to the Wagner Group in some ways. It was the outcome of some other PMCs in Russia, specifically this one called Moran Security, which was pretty widespread, had like maritime security operations. In a lot of ways, wasn't that distinct on paper or in its activities from what we'd see from that sort of explosion of PMCs that happened around the time of the global war on terror, the advent of piracy in Somalia, etc. Slavonic Corps, which grew out of that, was a much more adventurous project that was originally supposed to be based around specifically site security in Syria, but grew into something that was actually going to undertake combat operations together with Syrian forces. Had a pretty disastrous episode in Syria in 2013, but a lot of the people that survived that and came out of Slavonic Corps then went on to serve with Wagner in their early days. Utkin was with Wagner from the first. He is definitely one of the founding members, and to hear Wagner fighters tell it, he is one of the founding fathers of the group. He ended up taking on a different call sign, going by Ninth. Still like to sign documents with either a large capital D or a SS. So a very colorful figure. He had a lot of forward combat roles in Ukraine and apparently early on in Syria. But later on, he sort of retreated from that role and was less present on the battlefield than some of the other field commanders that were much more present and directly in combat and earned a lot of respect from their men in that way. Valery Chekalov was another person who was on the flight. He's Prigozhin's deputy. He's been with Prigozhin since the days that predated Wagner. He was with him, was a major figure in the Concord group of companies that won lucrative catering contracts that were really how Prigozhin made his fortune. And he was the general director of the company that then owned Yevropolis, which was one of the major sort of commercial legal entities that supported Wagner finance, paid fighters, brought people on in terms of contracts, and of course, accepted payments for things like securing oil fields in Syria. So he's recently been accused by some Telegram channels in Russia of having engaged in corruption. I won't attempt to read the tea leaves on that. But
who isn't engaged in corruption in Russia?
So it's an interesting question around Wagner, because one of the reasons that we know a lot of what we know about the organization is that they've actually got very, very careful record keeping because of Prigozhin's preoccupation with avoiding corruption and graft. Everything, every purchase, every commercial agreement, anytime money changes hands, it has to be documented. So because of that, I think we can see a level of perhaps not professionalism, but at least competence and penalties for graft that led to a situation where in many ways Wagner could be more efficient than, say, the Ministry of Defense, where it's much easier to hide large levels of graft.
And Rob, talk a little bit about, you've spoken previously on other podcasts and this one too, about how Wagner really was a phenomenal may be the wrong choice of words, but a very good fighting force in Ukraine, at least compared to the rest of Russian MOD. What do you think made them so effective and so good?
Sure. So, first off, Wagner changed a lot during this war. So, what it began the war as and what it, became during Bakhmut was two, quite different things. Basically, when the war began in Ukraine before this, 2014, and in Syria and elsewhere, in Syria particularly, the Russian military was mostly playing a supporting role, whereas basically they were there to mostly provide artillery support, aviation support. They had special operations guys on the ground, and advisors to the Syrian military, and mostly it was supposed to the Syrian military did the fighting. And that was largely true, but when the Syrian military was not able to take certain positions, do assaults, that's when kind of Wagner played this kind of other role where these, this is not the Russian military, these are people who are not politically, these casualties that are not politically sensitive for Putin, but who are more capable at taking positions than, the Syrian army. And basically, this was a decision, I think, made by Russia's leadership that, okay, it's a good short-term option. The problem is that prevented a lot of the Russian military from gaining combat experience. And experience they did have was often, doing convoys, doing kind of fixed-site security, not assaulting positions and learning how to do that. And so basically, in Syria, Wagner became this elite kind of infantry force that was designed to do assaults. And they had they gained a lot of experience doing this. They often did not have that much support, which meant they had to kind of overcome things. It also developed that they became this kind of, greater focus on promotion based on merit, because either you achieved the goal or you failed. And if you failed, you'd be, demoted or you'd be released. And promotions were based on people who had achieved their goals. And it became a very, goal-oriented kind of organization. Whereas the Russian military, as we've seen, is, they're much more willing to accept people who, don't perform that well. And so when the war began, Wagner did not play a role initially. They got invited into it in late March. And at that point, the Russian military had taken heavy losses. We found out that a lot of the Russian motorized rifle units, were very strapped on personnel. They're often, 2/3 strength. They're very weak. And we also found that, motorized rifle units were not very good at doing dismounted operations. And so when they started going to cities or in other kind of assaults, it was the Russian military was leaning very heavily on the VDV, the airborne forces, naval infantry, putting Spetsnaz in this kind of role. And, the big kind of elements of the Russian military were not doing that great of a job. And so Wagner, when they came in, it was an additional force that could do assaults, that could go into cities, and had a greater ability, was more competent at this. They had more experience. And one important aspect was that the nature of these assault attachments, the way Wagner's organized, assault attachments are, roughly kind of a battalion size, roughly comparable to a Russian battalion, but the commanders are much, much more experienced. And so, the famous ones like Ratibor or Zombie or Lotos, these guys have 20 years of experience. They're often like in their 40s, 50s. They have a tremendous amount of combat experience, whereas Russian battalion commanders, right, have much less, because you get promoted from when you're a battalion commander to a regiment and so on. Whereas these guys kind of stay in those roles because they have a lot of authority in those roles. And so Wagner was
they're kind of like the NCOs, right?
I wouldn't say NCOs. I mean, it's a different organization, right? Where basically you have the officers don't get promoted; they kind of stay in these roles, but the roles are very, very important. They have a lot of autonomy, and so yes, you're only in charge of maybe 300 guys, but you have a lot of independence, autonomy. You can decide how to operate, and you're put in a very important role. And so it's in some ways it's more similar to special operations, but it's really not that comparable either. But anyway, when they played a key role in fighting Popasna and elsewhere in the spring and the summer. And then when the Battle of Bakhmut began, what Prigozhin kind of decided over the summer was he decided that the prison population was something they could tap into, and that there's a additional source of manpower. And one thing that was important, useful for Wagner in the spring was that the Russian military, because it's based around a conscripts where they draft people twice a year. Some of those guys sign contracts. That's how they get their personnel. They don't really go out and recruit. Whereas Wagner had a recruitment program. They had infrastructure across Russia to bring on people to go fight, and they had their own base in Molkino where they trained people. And so they had these kind of infrastructure to quickly take on guys and deploy them. And of course, they can pay people pretty well. And so serving in Wagner actually became quite desirable. Some Russian soldiers during the war in Ukraine joined Wagner, signed contracts with them because they thought it was a better place to fight. And so for a variety of reasons, Wagner became useful. And then when they tapped into prisoners, it became a completely different organization, right? So maybe pre-war, it was maybe 5,000 strong, maybe less than that. And it obviously ballooned to, multiple, orders of magnitude larger during the Battle of Bakhmut, where you heard different figures of, 30, 40, 50,000. I'm not sure what it was exactly. And basically what they were doing is they were taking their existing assault detachments, right, about 300 men strong. They would then basically add on 600 to 700 man convict units to these detachments, and they would kind of experiment about how to use convicts effectively. Different detachments use them in a very different way, but these detachment commanders had a lot more autonomy, a lot more ability to use initiative than the Russian military. And basically, Prigozhin, he's kind of seen as a commander, but he's not really a commander. It's really kind of Utkin was more of the commander, but then it was also assault detachment commanders. They would receive an order or task, and they would figure it out themselves, right? They weren't kind of dictated how to do something. They figured it out themselves. And of course, they know they basically have to show results. Otherwise, there'll be issues. And so, for a variety of reasons, Wagner was more effective. Once they started tapping the convicts, that became an important use of personnel, particularly before the Russian military really mobilized, right? So in a lot of the fighting in Bakhmut in October, November, December, the Russian military was just then mobilizing, trying to figure out how to do this. They weren't really fully up to speed on that. And so Wagner plays kind of an important role. But one thing that was really important to note is that Wagner is designed for assault. It wasn't designed for defensive operations. And the operations in Bakhmut in particular, it was dependent on MOD support. So in some cases, Russian military units were attached to Wagner. They came under Wagner's control. Once that battle ended, those units reverted back to MOD control. A lot of the support they were receiving was artillery. So VDV units, in many cases, it was artillery support from them, or it was, ATGMs or other kind of support. It wasn't necessarily paratroopers assaulting positions. It's still Wagner doing it, but that was, really critical support. And then a lot of other things from aviation or other things, armor and other motorized rifle units play a really important role supporting Wagner. And so I think some people came to this understanding that Wagner was more independent than it was. It was always dependent on the Russian military support for operations, the Russian government support for things. And so anyways, at the end of this battle, we obviously saw these videos of Prigozhin, increasingly complaining about Shoigu and Gerasimov. One thing that's really important to note is that, yes, the amount of ammunition during the battle fluctuated that they received from the MOD, but Wagner was receiving far more support than most of the parts of the front. So there's assaults all over the winter in Avdiivka and the Crimea area and Vuhledar, and yet Wagner was receiving a lot more artillery support throughout most of this, and they were able to kind of negotiate that kind of situation. But ultimately, as the Battle of Bakhmut went on, Prigozhin was playing more and more of a role. That was clearly making people uncomfortable. It was clearly, I think, is one reason why Gerasimov was put back in charge of the war in January, was the MOD wanted to reassert control. he brought figures from Moscow who were not involved in the war as kind of deputies, like Selyukov and Kim and other figures who were not the right people for the positions. It was very clear the MOD was trying to reassert control, and it was clear at the end of this battle that once it ended, the MOD never wanted Prigozhin to be in a position where he could kind of dictate terms to the MOD. And because the winter offensive failed, Bakhmut was the one place where there was some kind of success to the Russian military, so they kind of had to grin and bear it while the battle went on. Once the battle ended, it was very clear Shoigu, Gerasimov, they wanted to kind of push Wagner out of the situation or subordinate them, and Putin obviously went along with it. And that kind of set the conditions for the mutiny that happened in June.
Jack, what is your sense, to the extent that you've been able to ascertain it, of how Wagner, whether it's field commanders and officers, as well as the regular infantrymen, viewed Prigozhin? Because he did not have a military background, right? He was much more of a manager, financial organizer, connector to the MOD and so forth, but not the strategic military genius that was responsible for this campaign. So do you have a sense of how they viewed him both during the course of the fight in Bakhmut and the rest of Ukraine, as well as in Africa?
To generalize, I'd say that there's a fair amount of respect for Prigozhin, despite the fact that he had no real military background. He has a pretty compelling story. He's obviously really great at telling that story. He's been really great at building a brand for Wagner. And I think he's done a good job of walking the line between what I think would be self-parody around him pretending to be someone who is a commander calling shots on specific operations at the front. As Rob said, a lot of that command authority was devolved. And I think that was part of the reason that he was respected. He could really draw a firm line between himself and the organization that he could claim to have built, although he really only just was one of many playing a role in that, and other organizations within the MOD, as well as other PMCs, especially later on, prior to Wagner withdrawing from Ukraine. He was pretty vocal about criticizing other PMCs, their lack of professionalism, and their general attitude towards the war. So generally, the limited number of folks that I've spoken to and the conversations that we can see these guys having online, they have a fair amount of respect for Prigozhin. Where there's not respect, there's at least an admiration for his ability to make their enemies angry. And the fact that in many ways he's a symbol of sort of sticking it to an establishment that's upset them, to say nothing of how he stuck it to NATO, the West, etc.
He was a master troll, right? I mean, his outbursts on Shoigu, the letters that he's written congratulating him very facetiously on his birthday. I mean, they're just a masterpiece of trolling that I think even Elon Musk would be proud of. But, there has been this persistent rumor for many years that Prigozhin, when he was in prison in the 1980s for robbery, armed robbery, and all kinds of other nefarious activities, was actually raped in prison and made a petuch in Russian, which is in the Russian prison culture means you're the lowest person that is effectively untouchable, right? And even after you leave prison, no one from the prison culture should ever associate with you. Unclear whether that was true or not, but it seems like even the rumor of that has not really affected his reputation, particularly when they started recruiting all these prisoners from the Zona, right? What do you make of that?
I don't think that people bought it necessarily. I think that a lot of that felt like an information operation. It felt like an attempt to undermine Prigozhin. And I think that he had relationships that he built with people from his prison days. When he came out of prison, the stature that he was able to develop pretty clearly and quickly in private industry were things that he could rely on, where he didn't even really have to engage with a lot of those sort of rumors directly. We can certainly see other criticisms of him that he's engaged with very aggressively. Things like that he didn't really seem to give much oxygen to. And I think that because of his credentials, because he had people that were themselves respected, that had a clear idea of who he was and were very open about singing his praises, he didn't have too much to be concerned about there. I do think some of the later activities that I think we can variously attribute to likely starting with the security services to undermine Prigozhin are pretty interesting. They weren't generally attacking him directly, but a lot of them attacked his family. So, for example, one of his daughters had her Telegram account pretty clearly hacked. A lot of videos were released that were definitely not intended for public consumption, that show her being really drunk or talking to her friends and sobbing and generally bragging about her wealth. and sort of being a bratty rich kid generally, which I think in the vacuum maybe wouldn't look so bad, but that was happening right against the backdrop of Prigozhin's sort of most heated criticisms of the Russian elite writ large. And of course,
when he was portraying himself as a man of the people, right?
Exactly. And there was this sort of series of revelations through posts by, of course, anonymous Telegram channels, etc., around his family, their wealth, and particularly their vacations to places like Dubai, to say nothing of what Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation put out around their holdings in places like Germany, and his daughter's proclivity for show jumping and things like that.
Rob, you mentioned your theory that, which is really interesting, that Putin, if it was indeed Putin that ended up assassinating Prigozhin, that the reason that they waited was that they needed to figure out some sort of resolution to the Africa adventure and how to replace Wagner in Africa. So if that is indeed going to be the case, where do you think the Africa effort goes from here? Do you think that they're going to find new PMCs to flow into Africa, perhaps with less experience, both cultural experience, relationships on the ground, as well as combat experience? Do you think GRU itself will take over? I mean, they're all pretty busy in Ukraine right now. They've got their hands full. So how are they going to manage Niger, Sudan, Mali, all those places where they're trying to play a role?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. This is not a great time to do, for the mutiny to happen. Because you said, right, the GRU, FSB, other security services should be very focused on the war. I think that the counteroffensive is probably going to be winding down next few weeks. So, when this began, it was a quite kind of bad time because it's right when the counteroffensive was beginning. And I think there's, some uncertainty about whether or not Ukraine would really be able to push, quickly through the lines. Russian lines have, held the last couple months. So, they might feel as though they're in a better position to respond right now. There was news that one of the former Wagner commanders, a guy who's photographed with Putin when Utkin and others received the Hero Russia Award in 2016, that he was, I think, willing to go to Redoute, and potentially that would be, that Redoute would be used as kind of the replacement, and Redoute was more subordinated to MOD. I'm not fully sure on exactly what happened. Obviously, it's going to be a big question right now. But one thing we heard after the mutiny happens is that there are a number of reports that Russian officials were going to a lot of these countries like Syria, to other countries in Africa, where they were trying to reassert the kind of bilateral relations that is a Russian government to other government relationship, and not through Wagner. And so I think they were making that effort. I think Sergei Lavrov was doing some of these trips, although I could be wrong. I think that was part
you also had the Africa summit a few weeks ago, right? That right. Putin held in St. Petersburg, where some senior GRU officials attended with these leaders of African countries that came there. So there's a sort of all-front push from the Russian government, from Putin on down, to establish closer relationships in Africa.
Right, and I think Prigozhin was there actually as well and took a photo. So yep. I mean, it must have been interesting to see. I think ultimately, a lot of this we're not seeing publicly. I'm assuming the last couple months that the Russian government has looked at how can they reassert control, how can they make sure that their relationships with these countries is a Russian government to government relationship and not going through Wagner. And then of course, look, Wagner's operations depend on the Russian government. Yes, they make money with mining contracts or taking control of natural resources in other countries. But, their equipment is flown there by the Russian Air Force. A lot of the equipment that's used is still from the Russian military. And of course,
there's a practical issue here, right? Because you can have all the money in the world, but how are you going to buy Panzer air defenses, right? Or T-90 tanks? Like, you can't just buy them on the credit card, right? So right. For you to purchase them, you're going to need connections in MOD.
Right, absolutely. And so, and again, like a lot of Wagner's operations in Africa, the countries, it's been a bit ad hoc. So it depends what the situation is, they'll deploy different kind of assets. So, Libya, where it was much more of a kind of conventional fight, right? That's where Wagner had Panzers. That's where they're using other kind of high-end equipment. Whereas in other deployments, right, they can get by with, with kind of technicals or kind of, they don't necessarily need tanks or other kind of vehicles. So it depends a lot on that. But ultimately, it always depends on the Russian government. The Russian government has to support them, has to fly these things there. in many cases, right, the local government, they're receiving Russian armor as well, like, modernized BRDM2s, things of that nature. And so it's a really important role for the Russian government. And so ultimately, if there's a risk of the Russian government not playing a role, right, Wagner's operations in those countries, would have to be very, very different. So Jack may have a better idea than I do. I'm not sure exactly how this will work out. I think one thing that was pretty obvious, it was that the Russian government was going to try and find out whether or not all these assault detachment commanders of Wagner were going to be loyal to Prigozhin. They wanted to see probably whether or not they could replace Prigozhin and keep Wagner kind of as an organization under someone more reliable. The fact that Utkin was apparently killed with Prigozhin today, right, might be a symbol that basically they could not break the two of them apart. I think what's important also is that, some of those key figures that were killed today, if this all is true, these are kind of people that are behind the organization of Wagner, whereas the detachment commanders, as far as we know, have not been killed or still alive. And those are the guys that run combat operations, but can't necessarily kind of put the overall organizational framework together. And so I think that might be what, they kind of went after. But, as Jack was saying before, a lot of the kind of connecting tissue and the center of gravity of Wagner is really these really experienced commanders, these assault detachment commanders. Radibor has been in charge of one since 2015 or so, right? And many of these guys have done multiple deployments to Syria, Libya, elsewhere, and so they have a tremendous amount of influence, and their role is really important. And so it's always been a question of, okay, if you want to replace if these guys leave, whatever organization you have is no longer Wagner, because the culture will be different, the experience will be different, it'll be something new. Now, over time, Russia may be able to figure out some new organization that can, perform that role, but there's going to be differences, and other issues may come about, right? There might be more, competition within the group. There might, any number of kind of things can come up, and ultimately, it's mostly speculation at this point. But it will certainly be interesting to watch. Obviously, there's a lot of events going on in Mali and elsewhere right now, and Wagner's role or whoever can replace them is going to be something to look for. And as you mentioned, right, Russia still needs personnel for fighting Ukraine. And so the MOD is still focused on Ukraine as the most important mission for the Russian Ministry of Defense right now. And, I think they're happy with someone else kind of dealing with these deployments in other countries. But of course, they don't want someone or an organization that's going to compete with them that's a threat to them. And so, they're going to look for some kind of alternative.
Yeah, I mean, if you, as a Russian soldier, have a choice of going into the meat grinder of Ukraine or going to a fairly cushy fight in Mali, right? It's probably not even close.
Yeah, I think, so during a lot of the fighting in Bakhmut, right, professionals were playing a role. But I think Prigozhin cares more about his professionals and whether or not they're wounded or killed than the Russian Ministry of Defense cares about most of the soldiers. Because ultimately, every one of those guys, the professionals, are guys that can be used, in Mali, in CAR, and other countries where they can, perform contracts. And you want to have quality personnel, right? The quality really matters in those countries. You have fewer people doing these jobs. So I think that was really important. I think one of the reasons why convicts became the main option was this expendable thing where Wagner can still play a role in Ukraine. It can still kind of increase political clout for Prigozhin, but maybe at a less of a cost to Prigozhin and to Wagner as an organization, because these are more expendable people. And we talked to some of the people, who fought against Wagner in Bakhmut on the flanks. On the flanks, it was largely convicts, right? There wasn't much professionals inside the city itself. Depending on which assault detachment was fighting, they'd fought in different ways. Sometimes it'd be kind of 3 waves of convicts first to, force Ukrainians to use up ammunition, to expose kind of true weapons. And the professionals would come maybe in the 4th or 5th wave, right? And they would be more competent. And at that point, they'd have some advantages. So it varied how they operated. But, certainly... I think Prigozhin cared a lot about those personnel. And I think also it's one of the reasons why, we're seeing soldiers sign contracts with Wagner during the Battle of Bakhmut, because they thought that, one, they're getting paid better, and 2, they're probably going to be taken care of more, and that the leadership there cared more about these guys surviving than maybe the Russian Ministry of Defense did. And if you look at some of the battles like in Volodar or elsewhere, like, you can get that impression, right, where some of the most elite Russian units took extremely heavy losses. And it was very clear this battle is not going to work for them. They didn't have the capabilities of overcoming Ukraine's defenses there, and yet they kept doing these kind of assaults, and led to very heavy losses and nothing to show for it.
Jack, Rob mentioned some of the names, some of the call signs. Who are the most critical field commanders right now that are left in Wagner. Talk a little bit about them and how many of them you think there are.
So this, similarly to the sort of larger structure of Wagner, changed a lot over the course of the war in Ukraine, as Rob pointed out. There's some folks that have great experience that have been brought in and promoted even since that time, so over a relatively short time horizon. But I'd say that the sort of most significant people, Alexander Kuznetsov, Radibor, another one who appeared in that infamous photo with Putin, alongside Utkin and Troshev. He's certainly one of the most respected. Been with the organization since the start. He's someone where if you talk to fighters, they'll tell you that he continued to serve in the front lines, even when a lot of the other assault detachment commanders were starting to pull back and be more cautious. And specifically just seems to be one of the fighters that has the most combat experience and generally just seems to be the most respected in terms of a willingness to put himself on the line for his men, willingness to make decisive decisions on the battlefield. He has a lot of legend surrounding him, and often it's difficult to extricate that from his actual performance and personality. He's certainly very feared in other parts of the organization. There are other assault detachment commanders, like Rob mentioned Zombie, Boris Nizhvinok. He's someone who's pretty well known because he's being put front and center. Generally, again, I've heard things around him being competent, but I think that a lot of it is he's somebody that has solid military experience before he came into Wagner. He can project professionalism. And because of that, he has been put as one of the sort of talking heads in Ukraine. The same goes for Anton Elizarov, Lotus. Lotus, I think, generally has some less respect. It's hard to attribute those to specific incidents just because a lot of it's rumor. But when you see people talking about them, they certainly hold different commanders at totally different levels of expectations for how they perform and their level of trust in them. Lotus, like Zombie, is somebody that's been put forward by the organization as a representative, as a face of the org. And so for that reason, I think he may not have been selected purely by virtue of the fact that he's someone who's particularly effective, but also because he's somebody that they can trust to be a presentable person to represent Wagner. And we saw increasingly over the course of the war in Ukraine, various commanders becoming more visible, not just Prigozhin. And even after the mutiny, a lot of these guys were being used as mouthpieces to do things like smear Troshev after he went over to the Ministry of Defense, to do things like make specific comments that were very much in line with the kinds of criticism that Prigozhin would make of the Ministry of Defense. So they were being sort of leveraged for that same reason. The other folks that I think are important are obviously those that are still in Africa. So like there's some people there that reportedly run, for example, Mali operations. It's a guy named Maslov who's kind of risen from apparently being a driver in the very early days all the way up to being in charge of a specific theater. In Belarus, you've got Pioneer, who is recently established as being at least nominally the head of what they're doing in Belarus. Again, that's less oriented around combat operations, more focused on training, but nonetheless, I think it'll be important to make sure that the Ministry of Defense can capture Pioneer, make some kind of deal with him, somehow engage with him if they're going to resolve things in a neat way with the fighters who are still in Belarus. So there's still a lot of human capital that's out there, and that human capital is pretty spread around. It's pretty well embedded. And I think to Rob's point about replacing Wagner in a lot of these countries, a lot of that human capital, a lot of those assault detachment commanders and the people that report directly to them, they've built strong relationships with the security forces in the countries that they're operating in. And I think that's going to be really hard to replace. And that's one of the reasons that it would be much, much easier if the Ministry of Defense can bring these guys on side. There's this sort of weird phenomenon I see with, Rob described, I think very aptly, that the delay is likely due to the fact that the security services wanted to be able to organize something that was going to be more effective than just knocking off Prigozhin the day after the coup and having to deal with a lot of fallout and probably unforeseen blowback. I also think that sort of conversely, getting rid of Prigozhin and Utkin, it may have turned out, was also necessary in order to have a resolution for what they were going to do with those fighters in places like Africa and Belarus. As long as Prigozhin was still around and able to at least somewhat credibly offer the opportunity for there to be continuing membership in Wagner and some of the benefits that Rob described around that, it was going to be really, really hard to pull guys away from Wagner into another structure where they could suspect that they were not going to be paid as well, not going to be treated as well, and that their initiative wouldn't be rewarded in the same way. So I think that getting rid of those two...
It strikes me, if you put yourself in the shoes of one of these guys, let's say Mali, right now, you're facing a couple of immediate issues, right? So first of all, who's going to be paying you, right? The Concord Group may continue to pay your salaries, or it may not, because the guy in charge is gone now. So I'm not sure that anyone in St. Petersburg is going to be very attentive to your needs out there in Mali, versus trying to rob the organization blind and trying to set up their own future, right? And then there's a question of where you're going to get logistical supplies, whether it's food or munitions, weapons, etc. Who's going to take care of all of that? And maybe that presents the opportunity to the GRU or others in MOD to go to these guys and say, look, you're stuck out here. No one's paying you. You're not getting the weapons and munitions you need. We're going to take care of all of that for you. All you have to do is just sign this contract, right? That can start to look very, very appealing once you're all alone.
Yeah, I think that definitely this has created a situation where it is much more appealing by virtue of the fact that there aren't really other options. I wrote a piece for Riddle Russia that came out this Monday, fortunately, before all this happened, and fortunately also was based largely around a lot of the dilemmas that the Russian state continues to have to face, and that a lot of the SALT detachment commanders and other leadership that survive amongst Wagner will have to consider. And a big element of that is what shape the organization could take if it's subsumed into MOD, or if it were to try to survive on its own. I really don't think there's a possibility of it trying to survive on its own without sort of its major caretakers in terms of the corporate infrastructure, which is really the part of the organization that Prigozhin could lay claim to. That's what he had built, that corporate infrastructure of 350 plus companies, a wave of bureaucrats that were handling all of that, et cetera. Without that, it's nigh impossible for these guys to make sure that they're going to get fed, get moved, get armed. And I do think that, that kind of ultimatum would probably be one that's very effective. What happens afterwards and their ability to continue executing on behalf of their clients or their hosts in some of these countries is another question. And I think that'll lead us to some other very interesting dilemmas if it happens to be that Wagner's sort of capacity to operate and defend their hosts is greatly diminished in these countries where they have indeed come to play a pretty important role in terms of the security balance, whether that's against Islamist militant groups in the Sahel or against sort of consortium of rebel groups in the Central African Republic.
It strikes me that one of the qualities that people may underappreciate of Prigozhin's, and look, he's absolutely a very despicable guy. Let me be very clear. This is not someone to be admired. He is the guy that orders people to have their skulls smashed with sledgehammers, of course, tortures people, executes people. Not a nice guy. But the one thing that he was really good at, I think, is his organizational quality. The guy has started and ran a lot of businesses, right? And even just if you think about the logistical challenge of, in the midst of the fight in Ukraine, to go around, recruit all these convicts, figure out the training for them, equipping, putting them into formations, launching assault units with those guys, that takes a lot of organizational expertise and know-how. And it's not clear to me that the Russian military could have done that half as well as he's managed to do. And that's on top of continuing all these operations all over Africa in different countries, different political environments, different logistical challenges of flowing people in, flowing logistical supplies in, and so forth. He was, even though not a military genius by any means, at an organizational level, seems to have been just absolutely essential to this organization. Do you agree, Jack?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, similarly, we can tend to focus on the aspects of Prigozhin as a character that are obviously vary from being just absolutely despicable to being this sort of like caricature, this supervillain. But undeniably, he was an important part of why Wagner was successful. I think part of that was that he created a huge culture of fear, which you can see documented in the emails of the employees of the Wagner Group that have since been leaked. A lot of what they're doing is trying to cover themselves and make sure that they can't be accused of impropriety. But what that did lead to was an expectation that there would be results. And I think that within the broader sort of Wagner organization, whether we're talking about the commercial side, the political technologist, the administrators, and the fighting men, there was an expectation that you would perform. And if you didn't, there would be consequences. And those consequences could be quite nasty, up to being physically punished. Even if you weren't within the actual fighting force of Wagner, there were employees that were subject to corporal punishment. So I think that part of this was that there was a heavy stick component as well as the carrot component around things like promotion based on merit. In addition to that, definitely he had a lot of experience in business, was well connected, and I think that a major part of it was Prigozhin's overall ambition. I don't think that he was somebody that aspired to become the leader of Russia, but nonetheless would like to be part of the inner circle and enjoy the access to rents, the security, the influence that folks that are close to Putin do enjoy.
You never know. I actually think that if you look at his public statements over last year, he's become quite a populist, and I wouldn't rule it out that had he lived, if he's indeed dead, that he did have political aspirations, perhaps post-Putin, perhaps even to challenge Putin one day. But he was clearly building a media persona, a public political persona, even if he wasn't participating directly in the political process.
Definitely. It's a shame we can't ask him now. But I think it was pretty clear that he, like Putin, did aspire to be a great man of Russian history in many ways.
I think, we talk about Wagner, we talk about Prigozhin. It's a relative, right? It's a comparison. And the comparison is the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian military. And so when Wagner is more effective at things, it's quite notable because the Russian military has done a poor job at a lot of these things. And all militaries, I think, suffer to some extent about whether or not they have the right incentive structure in place and whether or not they're results oriented. I think that's very true for the Russian military, where promotions are not necessarily based on competency, but on other factors. And even when guys fail, they still get promoted. And we've seen that during this war as well. And that I think what Prigozhin brought is that you asked before the Jack, when Jack explained as well. Even though he has a military background, he chose the right people to lead the organization. So Surovikin has a lot of credibility with fighters. He brought in the right people who were experienced guys. Many of these assault detachment commanders have a background as Spetsnaz officers who fought in Chechnya, elsewhere. Radobor was part of Senej, the GRU Spetsnaz unit that would become the main unit of Russian SSO, its Special Operations Command. So a lot of these figures had that kind of credibility. What Prigozhin realized is that he didn't have to micromanage this. It was, you select the right people, and then his role was basically to have the right political connections and then get them the right kind of financial support and other kind of equipment support and things of that nature. And it was clear, in Syria and elsewhere, is that Wagner commanders got very angry with the Ministry of Defense for a variety of reasons, often because they weren't getting supported properly and they were doing the real fighting. That was, a criticism in Syria, it was a criticism here in Ukraine as well. And I think they appreciate that Prigozhin would go to try to get Putin to other people to lobby on their behalf. And so he played that role, I think, in an important way. And, Jack says too, it's really hard to create the right cultural organizations, particularly military or paramilitary organizations. And one of the things that Wagner had, at least, to a better extent than the Russian Ministry of Defense, is that it's more results oriented. There's more of an incentive structure to perform a certain way to achieve certain goals. And as Jack's saying, there is a fear that if you do not perform your job properly, right, the consequences could be extreme. And we knew about the stories in Bakhmut. A lot of the stories and the anecdotes are true, right? I mean, prisoners were not allowed to retreat, and they didn't retreat because their life, or the length of their life, was going to be better assaulting in these kind of very unlikely to survive waves against Ukrainian forces than they were if they retreated, because they knew they'd get assassinated.
He brought back Stalin's tactics during World War II, right? The Smersh tactics, that if you step back, you're going to get executed.
Yeah, and it wasn't. I mean, and I think also like commanders, there were some anecdotes of commanders who pulled back, wouldn't go forward, getting executed on the spot. Those kind of things were occurring. This is not exaggeration, and absolutely, if the reason this was effective in Bakhmut is that typically, if you have an assaulting force, if the defender inflicts maybe 20% attrition on a squad or platoon, right, that unit's probably going to fall back, right? That's too many casualties to probably continue pushing. With these convict units, Ukrainian units would have to maybe kill all of them, or would have to, inflict 80, 90% casualties before they stop, because they had no other choice. And that means, it's a much tougher fight. It required more ammunition. It's much more arduous on the defender. And ultimately, it was an effective, it was somewhat effective, but it depended on playing by a set of rules that was not, permissible in the Russian military, that would not be permissible in most militaries because it was so draconian. And again, that was part of the Wagner culture, right? Can you recreate that? Maybe, but it's not that simple. And we start pulling out these, more experienced commanders who have respect from the guys who are fighting there. And again, I think, Wagner was perceived as having better leadership than most Russian military units, which is why guys, the Russian military, are signing contracts with Wagner during this war. And to recreate that would be difficult. And ultimately, Prigozhin played a role in that. Surovikin played a role in that. And these assault detachment commanders, right, and we don't know what they're going to do, they all play a role in that. And so, when we talk about whatever this organization will be long-term, whether it's Wagner or Redoute or, they take over some of these people, the culture could change, the organization could change. A lot of that is really unknown. And it'll be interesting to see exactly what that looks like, a month or two from now.
Well, look, guys, there's still so much unknown. We don't have the confirmation of their deaths. We don't know who was behind it, if it was indeed an assassination. But there's a couple of things that are very clear to me. One is that however this plane, this Embraer jet, went down, it probably was not because someone missed to do an oil change. And the other thing that's pretty clear is that in the Game of Thrones, if you don't win, you die. And Prigozhin certainly played with fire all of his life from a very young age when he set himself on a path of crime till the very end, if it is indeed his end. So the one thing I want to say, and Rob, curious for your thoughts on this, but it was interesting how when you and I and the rest of the team were in Ukraine talking to Ukrainian officials, very few people there cared about Wagner and thought it was relevant to their war, at least at this stage of their war. And talking to people in Kiev today, they were sort of watching this with interest, but almost disconnected interest. Yeah, let's take out the popcorn, but we also have a war to fight, and whatever happens with Prigozhin is not really going to affect our ability to continue this counteroffensive or even affect most likely the outcome of this war. So it seems to me, as interesting as this episode is, it is also interesting to see how much disinterest there is in Ukraine in this whole issue.
Yeah, I mean, look, Wagner's not playing a role in the war right now. It was never clear after Bakhmut what role they'd play. When they were replaced by the Russian Ministry of Defense units in the first week of June, some of those Russian MOD units that were attached to them reverted back to the Russian MOD. Obviously, the Russian MOD kept all the artillery and other things that were theirs. I think some of the equipment was transferred back to the Russian MOD after the mutiny as well. And some convict units were transferred over to the Russian MOD and became Storm Z units, which they're using. So, it was never fully clear what role Wagner would play after that. I thought at the time the mutiny probably would not have that much effect on the war because particularly, Bakhmut obviously has been a key part of the fighting, but, the main axis of advance has been down in Orihov in the Zaporizhzhia area. Wagner was not playing a role down there. The Russian MOD units down there didn't have much role with Wagner either. So there's, little reason to think it would have too much of a role there. And, I think the same thing today, right? I don't think whatever happened today, it's not clear to me it's going to have much of an effect on the counteroffensive. One of the significant things, and I think we talked about this before, was that in some ways, this counteroffensive was a significant moment after the mutiny because the mutiny could have exacerbated really significant issues in Russia, including Shoigu and Gerasimov's positions. And depending on how this counteroffensive went, right, that could have been a significant factor. And thus far, the Russian Ministry of Defense has fought pretty well. They defended pretty well in the south. They had pretty good defenses. They've used their resources much better than in other parts of the war. And so in some ways, I think Shoigu and Gerasimov's position might be stronger now than it was before because not only did they kind of pass this loyalty test to Putin that obviously Prigozhin failed, but also the Russian military is performing a little better. Now, that may not, when they go on the offensive again, they may not succeed again or they may have more issues. But I think that's it's a factor here. So I'm not sure any of this is going to affect the war, directly. It was never clear if Wagner was going to have another role in the war going forward. So I think it's important to keep in mind, this is a really significant moment. Obviously, it's very significant, I think, for domestically in Russia, it's significant, for a lot of these Russia's relationship with Africa and other countries. In terms of the war in Ukraine, not clear to me that it's going to have that much of an impact anytime soon.
Well, most importantly, it's very significant for Jack's book that thankfully he hasn't yet finalized, so he can at least write the ending for it. But the other thing that I think is significant is this whole episode with Surovikin, because this defensive line that you've talked about that is giving Ukrainians so much heartburn right now, to say the least, is called the Surovikin line for a reason, that he was the most competent general of this war, closely affiliated with Wagner. He set up not just the lines and the fortifications, but the entire defense plan for this offensive. And he's the one guy that took the fall for this mutiny, right? He was detained, put under house arrest apparently, and now dismissed.
Yeah, I mean, Surovikin, it's interesting to see what will happen. So, he was apparently dismissed, but he's still the MOD. He very well may pop up again, right? Remember with Alexander Lapin, he was relieved as Central Multi-District Commander, Central Grouping Force Commander as well. He now is, I think, Deputy Commander of the Ground Forces, but he was also seen, playing a role in Ukraine after that, and is also seen as moving vehicles around Belgrade, doing whatever. So, people get rotated.
But Rob, the difference is that if you're Lapin, you can be dismissed temporarily for incompetence. That's not a fatal mistake. But perhaps being competent and perhaps also disloyal, that you cannot do.
True. But, I think there's still some question about what Surovikin did. I think the idea is that he may have had some forewarning, but didn't necessarily play an active role supporting the mutiny. It also depends what Wagner looks like, right? And Prigozhin and Utkin, if they're dead, if Wagner has been diminished and kind of is no longer a threat, then maybe Surovikin is not one again, and this might be a quite significant signal to anyone who might think about coming after Putin again in the future. So I think right now it's still an open question about Surovikin. I do think Toplinsky is arguably maybe the most significant general fighting the war right now. The VDV commander also seems to have a kind of broader remit to go and fix things because other commanders have been less effective. I think there are some cases actually where Russia is promoting better commanders in some cases. So that'll be interesting going forward. But yeah, I mean, look, it's still a lot. We have more questions than answers right now. I think Surovikin is part of this. I think on one hand, Surovikin was never seen as a kind of genius, right? I mean, I think he made some reasonable decisions when after Kharkiv happens, when the Russian military was in trouble, right? To deciding to build good defenses, trying to figure out mobilization. But I wouldn't necessarily make that into him being a genius. I think he made reasonable decisions. I think the better example is that so many.
It's all relative, right? Compared to the other commanders, he made good decisions.
Yeah,
and we've talked about this before, that he is perhaps the ultimate survivor in the Russian military, aside from Shoigu, in that he's already participated in one coup in 1991 when he was responsible. His unit was responsible for deaths of 3 people that were protesting Putsch, the hardliner Putsch in 1991. He served a brief time in jail, was let go, got promoted, was responsible for the death, I think, of a subordinate under suspicious circumstances. Got through that, now dealing with this latest issue. So you could probably never count him out.
No, he's in the jail twice, because he was in the jail for the coup attempt, and then he was, when he was at the Frunze Academy in the mid-90s, he also allegedly played some role in smuggling weapons or giving it an unauthorized weapon to someone. Went to jail again, got out, and then when he was the first commander of Russia's military police. So some journalists kind of raised some eyebrows here that someone who's been in jail multiple times, that has this kind of colorful record, that he is the first guy to be put in the military police. But look, it's a sense of loyalty. And so it's hard to kind of say from the outside. Maybe Putin thinks Surovikin is loyal to him. Maybe he thinks that Surovikin was not loyal to Shoigu and Gerasimov. Maybe that's what he thinks this is about. All this is kind of trying to read tea leaves that we can't necessarily see. So it's really hard to say. I would just say, look, this war, we've seen so many extraordinary things. I would not count him out. I would not count out, different things happening as well. I'm just, I'm open-minded about how this might go. But, if the Russian military has more issues going forward and Gerasimov at some point gets relieved, which is possible, Surovikin might be someone they put back in to replace him, right? Maybe things look different 6 months from now. I think this war is going to still be going on. So I would not count him out.
Well, that's it from us. Rest in peace, or pieces, Yevgeny Prigozhin. You were a despicable, horrible human being. The world is much better without you. But you were entertaining and unique. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us.